"I'll take the children away from you," the Millionaire CEO said, and only later realized the twins were the ones who would change his life forever. The words fell into the warm air of the bakery like something sharp and metallic, completely out of place among the scent of fresh bread and vanilla. "I'll take the children away from you." Alexander King said it evenly, without raising his voice, as if stating a fact that required no emotion or explanation. He stood near the counter, tall and imposing, dark hair perfectly styled, blue eyes cold and unwavering, accustomed to rooms falling silent the moment he spoke. Mary froze. For a second she thought she had misheard him, that her mind was playing cruel tricks after another long shift that had started before dawn. Her hands were dusted with flour, her apron streaked from hours of work, and behind her the ovens hummed steadily, unaware that her world had just tilted. "You can't," she said quietly, her voice barely stronger than a whisper, but steady enough to betray how hard she was fighting to stay calm. Alexander's gaze moved past her, lowering to the two small figures pressed against her legs. The girls clung to her apron with identical hands, their dark hair falling into their eyes, their blue gaze wary and confused. 3 years old. Too young to understand words, but old enough to sense danger. He felt a brief flicker of something unfamiliar tighten in his chest before he pushed it away. "They're my daughters," he said. "That gives me every right." Mary instinctively shifted, placing herself more firmly between him and the girls. Emma buried her face into Mary's hip, while Lily peeked out cautiously, studying Alexander with an intensity far beyond her age. "You walked away," Mary said, her voice trembling now despite her effort. "You didn't want to hear the truth. You don't get to come back and threaten us." Alexander's jaw tightened. He remembered the message she had sent years ago, remembered dismissing it with irritation, telling himself she was exaggerating, manipulating, inventing a story that didn't fit into his carefully ordered life. He had never considered the possibility that he was wrong. Powerful men rarely did. "I'm not threatening," he replied coolly. "I'm stating what will happen. They deserve stability. Resources. A future you can't provide." Mary felt the familiar surge of fear rise in her chest, sharp and suffocating, but she refused to let it show. She had survived 3 years alone. Night shifts. Sick days. Empty bank accounts. She had held her daughters through fevers and nightmares, had learned to be strong when there was no other option. "They deserve love," she said. "And they already have it." Alexander's eyes flicked back to the girls, lingering just a second too long. He hadn't expected this part. The way they mirrored him so clearly, the way their expressions carried something unmistakably familiar. For a brief moment, certainty wavered, replaced by a quiet, unsettling awareness that this was not a business negotiation he could win by force alone. "I'll see you in court," he said at last, turning toward the door. Mary didn't follow him. She didn't shout or beg. She sank down behind the counter, wrapping her arms around Emma and Lily as the bell above the door chimed softly, announcing his departure to a world that hadn't noticed the damage he had just done. As the door closed behind him, Mary pressed her forehead against her daughter's hair, breathing in their warmth, their reality. Her hands shook, but her resolve hardened. Whatever he planned to take from her, she would not surrender them without a fight. The night after Alexander's visit stretched endlessly, heavy with a silence that pressed against Mary's chest until breathing felt like work. The bakery was closed, the lights turned off, but the smell of bread still clung to her clothes as she walked home with the girls, one on each side, their small hands gripping her fingers tightly. Emma and Lily didn't ask questions at first. They sensed something had shifted, something dangerous and unfamiliar, and their quiet was far more frightening than tears. At home, Mary went through the motions on instinct alone. She bathed the girls, dressed them in pajamas, read the same bedtime story they demanded every night. Her voice remained steady as she spoke, even when her thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. When she finally tucked them into bed, Lily reached for her wrist. "Mommy, that man was angry," she said softly. Mary swallowed, forcing a smile that felt too fragile to trust. "He's not important," she replied, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were no longer true. After the girls fell asleep, Mary sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the cracked surface she had never had the money to replace. Alexander's words echoed relentlessly in her head. "I'll take the children away from you." He had said it with the same certainty he once used to close deals and end conversations, and that terrified her more than shouting ever could. She remembered the past she had tried so hard to bury. She remembered being young and hopeful, believing that Alexander's intensity meant commitment, that his control was just confidence. She remembered the night she told him she was pregnant, the way his expression had hardened immediately, how quickly love had turned into suspicion. He had accused her of lying, of trapping him, of inventing a story for money she never wanted. She had walked away that night with nothing but pride and a promise to herself that she would never beg again. 3 years later, here he was, armed with wealth and certainty, ready to turn her life into a battlefield. The next morning, Mary woke before dawn, her body already tense. She dropped the girls off at daycare and went straight to the bakery, but her hands shook as she kneaded dough, her thoughts racing faster than she could control. Every sound made her flinch. Every customer felt like a distraction from the fear sitting just beneath her ribs. By midday, she knew denial was no longer an option. During her break, Mary stepped outside and called the only number she hadn't wanted to dial. A legal aid office she had once passed on her way home, telling herself she would never need it. The woman on the line spoke calmly, asking questions, explaining possibilities, using words like custody, paternity, and rights. Mary listened, nodding even though the woman couldn't see her, her heart pounding harder with every sentence. When she hung up, her hands were cold. Alexander moved quickly, just as she had known he would. By the end of the week, official letters began arriving, written in careful legal language that made his threat feel suddenly real and dangerously close. He was asserting his paternity, requesting DNA tests, seeking custody arrangements. The paper trembled in Mary's hands as she read them over and over, her mind struggling to accept how fast everything was unraveling. That evening, she sat on the floor of the girls' bedroom, watching them play with their dolls, their laughter bright and careless. They argued gently over whose doll was whose, then made up just as quickly, collapsing into giggles that filled the room. Mary pressed her palm to her mouth to keep from crying. She realized then that this was no longer just about fear. It was about protection. About standing between her children and a man who saw life as something to be won, claimed, controlled. Alexander believed he could take them because he had resources, because he was powerful, because he had never been told no in any way that mattered. Mary stood slowly, her legs unsteady but her resolve sharpening with every breath. He may have money. He may have influence. But she had been their mother every single day of their lives. And she would not let him forget that. The first court notice arrived on a gray morning, folded too neatly inside an envelope that looked far too calm for the damage it carried. Mary stood in the narrow kitchen, the kettle screaming softly behind her as she read the words again and again, hoping they might change if she stared long enough. They didn't. Alexander was officially asserting his rights. The threat he had delivered so casually in the bakery had become something solid, something that could reach into her life and tear it apart. She sat down slowly, her legs suddenly weak, and pressed her fingers to her temples. Fear surged, hot and disorienting, but beneath it something else began to form, quieter and more dangerous for him to underestimate. Resolve. Mary had spent 3 years learning how to survive without help. She had learned how to budget down to the last dollar, how to smile at customers even when exhaustion made her vision blur, how to be both gentle and unbreakable at the same time. She had not done all of that just to hand her daughters over to a man who had dismissed their existence with a wave of his hand. She called a lawyer. Not the kind Alexander hired, not polished or expensive, but a woman who listened without interruption and asked questions that mattered. They met in a small office with mismatched chairs and shelves crowded with files, and Mary told her everything. The accusation. The silence. The pregnancy. The birth. The years of absence. She spoke until her voice cracked, then kept going, because stopping felt like giving up. The lawyer listened carefully, her expression serious but not alarmed. She explained the process in clear, honest terms. Yes, Alexander had rights. Yes, money would give him advantages. But no, motherhood could not be erased by wealth alone. Courts cared about stability. About attachment. About who had been there every day when no one was watching. Mary left the office with a folder full of paperwork and a strange, unfamiliar sense of grounding. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. Alexander, meanwhile, moved through the process with ruthless efficiency. He ordered the DNA test immediately, convinced the result would only formalize what he already believed he deserved. To him, this was a correction of an old inconvenience, not a reckoning. He spoke of the girls in abstract terms, referring to their future, their education, their best interests, without once considering what those words sounded like to a woman who had soothed their nightmares and memorized the shape of their cries. The test confirmed what neither of them truly doubted. The girls were his. The news landed differently for each of them. For Alexander, it was vindication, proof that the world still obeyed logic and numbers. For Mary, it was a tightening knot of dread mixed with fierce protectiveness. The girl sensed the tension immediately. Emma became clingier, refusing to sleep alone. Lily grew quieter, watching Mary with wide, serious eyes that made her heart ache. One evening, as Mary tucked them into bed, Emma asked the question she had been dreading. "Is that man coming back?" Mary sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her daughter's hair slowly, choosing her words with care. "He might," she said gently. "But Mommy is here. Always." Lily reached out and grabbed Mary's sleeve. "Don't let him take us." Mary felt her chest constrict painfully, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I won't," she promised, knowing that promises were only as strong as the fight behind them. Court dates were scheduled. Papers were filed. The battle lines were drawn. Alexander prepared as he always did, confident and certain, convinced that logic and power would bend the situation to his will. He spoke to advisors about strategy and optics, already imagining a life where the girls lived in his world, one that made sense to him. Mary prepared differently. She gathered photographs, daycare records, doctor's notes, handwritten drawings taped to refrigerator doors. She documented bedtime routines, favorite foods, illnesses she had handled alone, nights she had stayed awake just to make sure their breathing was steady. She built her case not out of ambition, but out of love made visible. As the first hearing approached, Mary stood at the bakery counter one evening, watching Emma and Lily color quietly at a small table near the window. Their heads bent together, identical in posture, identical in trust. The sight filled her with a calm that surprised her. Alexander King might believe children were something that could be claimed. Mary knew better. They were something you protected, even if it meant standing against a man who had never been told that no was final. And she was ready. The first hearing took place in a building that felt designed to drain warmth from every human emotion. Pale walls, hard benches, the low murmur of voices that all carried the same tension. Mary arrived early with her lawyer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited, rehearsing calm in her breathing. She wore a simple dress, nothing that drew attention, nothing that could be misread as performance. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to protect her children. Alexander arrived later, confident as ever, flanked by his legal team. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that suggested this was just another meeting he intended to win. He barely looked at Mary at first, his focus fixed forward, already planning arguments and outcomes. To him, the courtroom was familiar territory. Power had taught him how to be comfortable in places where other people trembled. Emma and Lily were not present. The judge had ruled it unnecessary for the children to attend, a small mercy Mary clung to as she took her seat. The proceedings began with measured formality. Alexander's lawyer spoke first, outlining his resources, his stability, his ability to provide opportunities Mary could not. The words were polished, persuasive, delivered with practiced ease. Private education. Medical care. Security. A future without struggle. Each phrase landed like a quiet accusation, framing Mary's life as something insufficient by default. Mary listened without interrupting, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on a spot just above the judge's shoulder. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. When it was her turn, her lawyer spoke calmly, grounding every statement in specifics. Consistency. Primary caregiver. Emotional attachment. The girls' routines. Their health. Their sense of safety. Mary spoke only when asked, answering clearly, without exaggeration or bitterness. She described nights spent holding feverish bodies, mornings rushed but gentle, the bakery shifts balanced around daycare hours. She did not mention fear or money. She spoke of presence. Alexander shifted in his seat for the first time. The judge asked him a question directly, something simple but pointed. "Mr. King, how often have you seen your daughters since discovering their existence?" Alexander hesitated, just briefly. "A few times," he said. "The process is ongoing." "And before that?" He inhaled sharply. "I was not aware of them." Mary felt the weight of the lie he had once told himself settle heavily into the room. The judge nodded, expression unreadable. Temporary arrangements were discussed. Supervised visits. Gradual introduction. No immediate custody changes. The ruling was cautious, measured, and unmistakably protective of the children's stability. Alexander's jaw tightened. Outside the courtroom, the tension broke into sharp fragments. His lawyers spoke in hushed voices, already strategizing, already discussing next steps as if escalation were inevitable. Alexander stood apart, staring at the wall, replaying the hearing in his mind with growing irritation. He had expected resistance. He had not expected doubt. Mary stepped past him without looking, her legs trembling only once she reached the elevator. The doors closed, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her lawyer squeezed her arm gently. "This is a good start," she said. Mary nodded, though fear still pulsed beneath her skin. The first supervised visit was scheduled a week later in a family services center painted in bright, artificial colors meant to comfort children who did not need reminding they were in unfamiliar territory. Mary brought Emma and Lily herself, her heart pounding as she knelt to adjust their jackets, smoothing their hair, whispering reassurance they half understood. Alexander was already there. The moment the girls saw him, they froze. Emma pressed closer to Mary's leg, her fingers digging into fabric. Lily frowned, her small face tight with uncertainty. "This is just a short visit," Mary said softly, forcing calm into her voice. "Mommy will be right here." Alexander crouched several feet away, careful not to approach too quickly. For the first time since all of this began, he felt something crack through his certainty. The girls were not curious. They were not impressed. They were afraid. "I'm not going to take you anywhere," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I just want to talk." Emma shook her head, burying her face. Lily stared at him with wide blue eyes that looked painfully like his own, except where his held control, hers held pure vulnerability. The supervisor watched closely. Alexander sat down on the floor instead of the chair, lowering himself to their level, unsure what else to do. He realized then that this was not a negotiation, not a claim to be enforced. These were two small humans who did not owe him trust simply because his name appeared on their birth certificates. Mary watched from her seat, her chest tight, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of distress. She saw something shift in Alexander's posture, something she had never seen before. Uncertainty. Hesitation. A man used to control suddenly unsure of his place. When the visit ended, Emma refused to let go of Mary's hand. Lily glanced back once as they left, her expression unreadable. Alexander remained seated on the floor long after the room emptied. For the first time since he had walked into the bakery and issued his threat so easily, he felt the full weight of what he was trying to take. The aftermath of the first supervised visit lingered far longer than Alexander expected. He returned to his office that afternoon and sat through meetings without absorbing a single word, nodding at the right moments while his mind replayed the image of two small girls shrinking away from him. Fear. Not confusion or shyness, but fear. It was not something he had prepared for, and it unsettled him more deeply than the judge's cautious ruling ever had. For the first time, the idea that he could simply take what he believed was his began to fracture. Mary, meanwhile, carried the tension home like a second skin. Emma clung to her all evening, refusing to be more than an arm's length away, while Lily asked questions in a quiet, careful voice, as if afraid the answers might change if spoken too loudly. Mary answered honestly but gently, explaining that they would see the man again, that no one was leaving, that their home was still theirs. She repeated these reassurances until her throat ached, knowing that calm was something children borrowed from adults long before they could create it themselves. The next visits followed the same pattern, scheduled precisely, monitored closely. Alexander arrived early every time, resisting the urge to bring gifts or distractions that might feel like bribery. He sat on the floor, spoke softly, and waited. Some days the girls ignored him entirely, retreating into games that excluded him by default. Other days Lily crept closer, studying him with solemn curiosity, while Emma watched from a distance, her distrust unyielding. Mary never left the room. Alexander began to understand why. Every movement he made was measured against the memory of his threat, against the fear he had planted so carelessly. He noticed how Mary's posture tensed whenever he stood too quickly, how her eyes never left the girls. This was not hostility. It was vigilance sharpened by love. One afternoon, during a visit that felt quieter than usual, Lily dropped her crayon and watched it roll across the floor toward Alexander. She hesitated, then stood and walked slowly toward it. Alexander froze, unsure whether even breathing too loudly might send her retreating. She picked up the crayon, held it for a moment, then placed it carefully in his open palm before returning to Mary's side without a word. The gesture was small. It shattered him. That night, Alexander canceled another dinner with investors and went home alone, the silence pressing in from every direction. For the first time, he allowed himself to think not about winning, but about repair. He replayed his words in the bakery, hearing them now through the ears of a child who only understood that someone powerful wanted to take her away from the person who made her feel safe. The realization made his chest ache. He called his lawyers the next morning and told them to slow everything down. No aggressive filings. No sudden motions. No attempts to overwhelm. They argued, warned him about leverage and timing, but Alexander ended the conversation without debate. At the following visit, something changed. Emma tripped while running toward Mary and scraped her knee. She cried instantly, the sharp, breathless sobs of a child startled by pain. Mary stood to reach her, but Alexander was already kneeling, then stopped himself mid-motion, his eyes flicking to Mary for permission. Mary nodded once. Alexander extended his hand slowly, not touching, just offering support. Emma hesitated, then allowed him to steady her while Mary cleaned the scrape. She did not look at him, but she did not pull away either. When the crying subsided, Emma took Mary's hand again, but she glanced back once, brief and unreadable. It was enough. Mary noticed it all. She noticed how Alexander waited. How he asked before acting. How he left when time was up without protest or guilt. She did not trust him yet, but she could no longer deny that something fundamental was shifting. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Mary sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the same worn surface she had stared at on the night Alexander first made his threat. The fear was still there, but it was no longer alone. It was joined by something cautious and unfamiliar. Hope, restrained and watchful, but present. Alexander, for his part, lay awake in his apartment, the city lights casting long shadows across the ceiling. He understood now that fatherhood was not something claimed through courts or blood tests. It was something granted, piece by fragile piece, by children who did not care about power, only about who stayed gentle when they were scared. And for the first time since he had walked into that bakery so certain of his right to take, Alexander King realized that if he wanted to be part of his daughters' lives, he would have to learn how to earn them instead. The change did not announce itself with apologies or grand gestures. It arrived quietly, through choices Alexander made when no one was watching and no one was keeping score. He stopped speaking about custody as something to be won and began thinking about time as something that could be lost forever if he handled it wrong. That realization altered the way he approached everything that followed. The visits continued, still supervised, still structured, but the tension in the room slowly shifted. Alexander no longer arrived braced for rejection or armed with rehearsed calm. He came prepared to wait. He sat on the floor with the girls, sometimes reading aloud when they allowed it, sometimes simply watching as they played beside Mary. He learned to accept silence without trying to fill it, to let the girls decide if and when he was included. Emma remained cautious, her trust hard-earned and easily shaken. She watched him closely, testing him in ways only children could, deliberately dropping toys near him, deliberately ignoring him afterward, studying his reaction for disappointment or anger. Alexander passed these tests not by doing anything extraordinary, but by doing nothing at all. He waited. He smiled. He stayed patient. Lily, on the other hand, was curious in a quieter way. She asked questions without accusation, her voice soft but direct. Why did he have a different house? Why he wore suits? Why he didn't know their favorite songs? Alexander answered honestly, never over-explaining, never pretending to be more than he was. "I'm learning," he told her once. She considered this carefully, then nodded, satisfied with the answer. Mary watched everything, her instincts constantly alert. She noticed that Alexander never raised his voice, never corrected the girls harshly, never contradicted her in front of them. When disagreements arose, he deferred to her without hesitation. The shift unsettled her more than resistance would have. Control, she understood. This restraint required effort. Outside the visits, Alexander's life continued to rearrange itself in ways he could no longer ignore. He canceled trips. He delegated responsibilities he once guarded obsessively. His absence began to raise questions within his company, and for the first time, he did not rush to reassure anyone. He understood now that the kind of presence his daughters needed could not coexist with the kind of dominance he once demanded everywhere else. The cost was real. Advisors expressed concern. Colleagues questioned his focus. Friends remarked on how different he seemed. Alexander listened politely and said very little. Explaining himself felt unnecessary. For the first time in his life, he was not trying to convince anyone that he was right. The girls noticed the consistency long before Mary did. Emma stopped flinching when Alexander stood up. She stopped scanning his face for signs of impatience. One afternoon, she asked him to help her build a tower of blocks, correcting him sharply when he placed one crooked. He followed her instructions carefully, letting her lead. When the tower collapsed, she laughed instead of crying, and the sound caught Alexander off guard with its ease. Mary felt something tighten in her chest at the sound. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Emma hesitated, then reached out and took Alexander's hand for the brief walk to the door. She let go quickly, as if afraid of what the gesture meant, but the moment lingered long after. That night, Mary sat awake in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of her daughters. She replayed the day in her mind, weighing fear against evidence. Alexander was changing. Not dramatically. Not performatively. But steadily, in ways that were difficult to fake and even harder to sustain without sincerity. She hated that it made her hope. Alexander, meanwhile, sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city below. The memory of his threat echoed now not with arrogance, but with shame. He understood that no court ruling could erase the fear he had caused, that trust would take time measured not in weeks, but in years. For the first time, that didn't feel unbearable. It felt necessary. He was no longer trying to take his daughters. He was trying to become someone they might one day choose. The pressure that had been building quietly around Alexander finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. What he had once treated as background noise, expectations, demands, the constant pull of his professional life, now collided directly with the fragile progress he had made with his daughters. The collision was not dramatic, but it was relentless, arriving in the form of urgent emails, rescheduled meetings, and conversations that began with concern and ended with thinly veiled warnings. His partners noticed first. They commented on his absences, on his refusal to travel, on the way he no longer stayed late into the night chasing outcomes that once defined him. At first, they were patient. Then they grew uneasy. Alexander King had built his reputation on control and availability, and now he was offering neither. The confrontation came during a closed-door meeting that felt deceptively calm. The language was professional, carefully chosen, but the message beneath it was unmistakable. They needed him focused. Fully present. Uncompromised. Alexander listened without interrupting, his hands folded loosely on the table. When it was his turn to speak, he did not defend himself with numbers or projections. He did not promise improvement or temporary adjustments. "My priorities have changed," he said simply. The room went quiet. Someone asked if this was a phase. Someone else asked if he understood the risk he was taking. Alexander nodded once, acknowledging both questions without answering either directly. "I understand," he said. "And I accept it." That evening, Mary noticed the weight in his expression the moment he arrived for the visit. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, not physically, but emotionally, as if he had spent the day holding a line he refused to let anyone cross. She said nothing at first, watching as he sat on the floor with Emma and Lily, letting them climb over him, letting them lead the game without direction or correction. The girl sensed the shift before Mary did. Emma grew unusually quiet, studying Alexander with narrowed eyes as if she were trying to solve a problem she didn't have words for. Lily stayed close, her small hand resting against his sleeve, grounding herself in his presence. When it was time to leave, neither protested, but neither rushed away either. As Mary walked them toward the door, Emma stopped suddenly and turned back. "Are you leaving for a long time?" she asked. The question was simple. The fear behind it was not. Alexander crouched in front of her, careful not to rush his answer. "No," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Emma searched his face, looking for certainty she could trust. After a moment, she nodded, accepting the answer not as a promise, but as something to be tested over time. After the girls were asleep that night, Mary finally spoke. "You're under pressure," she said quietly. Alexander didn't deny it. "Yes." "You don't owe us anything," she continued. "I never asked you to change your life." He looked at her steadily. "I know. That's why this matters." She hesitated, then voiced the fear she had been carrying for weeks. "If you choose them, and it costs you everything else, I don't want them to feel responsible for that." Alexander's expression softened. "They won't," he said. "That choice is mine. And I should have made it years ago." The tension reached its breaking point a few days later. Mary received a call from the daycare in the middle of her shift. Lily had fallen and hit her head. It wasn't serious, but she was shaken and inconsolable. Mary left work immediately, her hands trembling as she drove, calling Alexander without thinking. He arrived before she did. Mary found him sitting on a small plastic chair, Lily curled tightly against his chest, her fingers gripping his jacket as if afraid he might disappear. Emma sat beside them, watching silently, her face pale but calm. Alexander looked up when Mary entered, relief washing over his features. "She's okay," he said quickly. "Just scared." Mary knelt beside them, pulling Lily into her arms, pressing kisses into her hair. Lily cried softly, then reached back toward Alexander, her small hand catching his finger without hesitation. Something inside Mary cracked open. That night, after the girls were asleep, Mary stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the familiar worn counter. She realized then that the question was no longer whether Alexander could hurt them again. It was whether she was ready to accept that he was choosing to stay, even when staying demanded sacrifice. Alexander, meanwhile, sat alone on his balcony, the city spread out beneath him. He understood now that the most difficult choice he had ever made was not stepping back from power or influence. It was choosing patience over control. And for the first time, he knew he would not step away from that choice, no matter what it cost him. The final hearing arrived without ceremony, marked not by anticipation but by a quiet resolve that had settled over all of them. Mary dressed the girls carefully that morning, choosing soft colors and comfortable shoes, focusing on familiar routines to keep their nerves steady. Emma and Lily sensed that something important was happening, though they didn't understand the details. They held Mary's hands tightly as they entered the courthouse, their small fingers warm and trusting, grounding her in the present. Alexander arrived separately, his posture calm but his expression open in a way it never had been before. He greeted the girls gently, without reaching for them, and waited for their response. Lily smiled faintly. Emma nodded. It was enough. The hearing unfolded slowly. Arguments were presented, evidence reviewed, questions asked and answered with careful precision. This time, when Alexander spoke, he did not emphasize his resources or influence. He spoke about responsibility. About time lost. About the damage caused by certainty without listening. His voice remained steady, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. "I made a mistake," he said plainly. "I believed authority gave me the right to decide for others. It doesn't. These children need stability, and they already have it with their mother. I don't want to replace that. I want to support it." The room felt different after that. Not warmer, but clearer. The judge listened, eyes moving between Mary and Alexander, then to the girls seated quietly beside their mother. The ruling, when it came, was measured and firm. Mary would remain the primary guardian. Alexander would have shared custody over time, expanded gradually, built around the girls' comfort and needs. No sudden changes. No forced separations. No battles. Mary felt her knees weaken with relief. Alexander accepted the decision without argument, without negotiation. For the first time, winning was not his goal. Presence was. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The visits were no longer supervised. Alexander picked the girls up himself, always on time, always returning them exactly as promised. He learned their routines, their fears, their preferences. He learned how to braid hair badly and how to read the same story 3 times in a row without rushing the ending. He learned that love was built not through declarations, but through reliability. Mary watched him carefully, still cautious, still protective, but no longer afraid. She allowed herself to rest in moments she hadn't known how to trust before. She accepted help without feeling indebted. She learned that strength did not always mean standing alone. One evening, as the sun set and painted the living room in soft gold, Emma climbed onto Alexander's lap with a book, settling there without hesitation. Lily followed, squeezing in beside them, her head resting against his arm. Alexander looked up at Mary, emotion tightening his throat, and Mary smiled back, the expression gentle and unguarded. Later, when the girls were asleep, Mary and Alexander sat together in the quiet kitchen, the air no longer heavy with unspoken fear. "You once said you'd take them from me," Mary said softly. "I know," he replied. "And I was wrong." "You scared me," she continued. "I know," he said again, his voice steady. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure they never feel that fear again." Mary studied him for a long moment, then nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was acceptance. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet victory that had taken place within those walls. No one had lost. No one had been taken away. Sometimes the most frightening sentence becomes the beginning of change. And sometimes a man who thought he could take learns instead how to stay, how to protect, and how to love without conditions. This time, the family remained whole, not because of power, but because of choice.